The KFC giveaway in Cleveland was only the beginning. What initially looked like a heartwarming gesture, fueled by a playful sibling rivalry, quickly transformed into a media spectacle and a business case study. While his brothers held their own events in Atlanta and Dallas, respectively, it was Shedeur's rollout in Cleveland that exploded into something far more impactful. If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed. It was a sheer scale of the Cleveland crowd, stretching around entire city blocks, full of fans in Sanders jerseys chanting his name, that made NFL executives sit up straight. It wasn't just about free food. It was about energy, influence, and reach. This wasn't orchestrated by the Browns. This wasn't a league-sponsored fan event. This was one rookie quarterback, technically the fourth stringer on the depth chart, commanding a level of attention typically reserved for Pro Bowl veterans. His presence pulled thousands of people off the streets and into conversation. It was civic electricity, and it forced a simple but uncomfortable question into NFL boardrooms. How does someone with no on-field stats yet command this much loyalty? The answer wasn't in the usual analytic spreadsheets or combined scouting reports. It was in narrative control and brand trust. Shedeur wasn't just showing up to give away chicken. He was showing fans that he understood them, respected them, and wanted to be part of their story. Cleveland, a city starving for quarterback stability and star power, responded by welcoming Shedeur like a hometown savior. The prime equity clause, buried deep in the fine print of his endorsement agreement, soon became public knowledge, at first through whispers, then through sharp analysis. The clause stipulated that Shedeur would receive additional marketing equity bonuses tied not to jersey sales or fantasy points, but to metrics like digital engagement, social impressions, and fan turnout at sponsored activations. It was a revolutionary structure. In a league where rookie contracts are tightly regulated by the collective bargaining agreement, Shedeur had found a legal backdoor to secure a financial interest tied to his personal market value, and he executed it with clinical precision. The clause's existence triggered quiet panic in NFL executive circles. Owners and GMs suddenly faced a new frontier where players, especially younger Gen Z athletes, would begin negotiating for more than just money. They would want influence, ownership, voice. Shedeur didn't just challenge the system. He proved that the old system was already outdated. Internally, league officials debated how to handle the optics. Some teams were furious, arguing that giving rookies this kind of power undermined traditional team structures and would lead to chaos. Others were curious, cautiously acknowledging that Shedeur's strategy might represent the next evolution in player value. It's one thing to have fans, one executive reportedly muttered to a colleague. It's another to own the entire city before taking a snap. Shedeur, for his part, remained quiet on the controversy. He let the results speak. Cleveland's economy benefited from the event. Local businesses around the giveaway zone saw double-digit sales spikes. Merchandise sold out within hours. Children got their first taste of what it meant to have a role model who cared deeply about community, not just touchdowns. In interviews, Shedeur stayed focused on the people. If you're going to lead a franchise, it starts with showing up, not just on Sundays, but every day, he said. This is home now. You take care of home. Those words struck a chord, and they weren't scripted. They were lived. Behind the scenes, other rookies started calling their agents, asking if equity clauses could be structured into their endorsement deals. Brand managers scrambled to develop frameworks. Legal departments got creative. In a matter of weeks, Shedeur's playbook had reshaped the entire rookie brand ecosystem, and he hadn't even thrown a pass. But Shedeur's plan wasn't about flash. It was about foundation. Every move had purpose. After the KFC event, he initiated a citywide literacy program in collaboration with local schools and libraries. The initiative, Prime Pages, offered free children's books at Brown's games and literacy workshops at public schools. His goal was simple: leave Cleveland better than he found it, not with slogans, but with deliverables. NFL veterans began to take notice. Linebackers, receivers, even opposing quarterbacks were quoted admiring Shedeur's poise, not just on field but in the face of sudden stardom. In a league where attention often becomes distraction, Shedeur remained locked in, focused, grounded. The Browns organization realized they had something rare, not just a talented athlete, but a visionary, one who inspired without demanding, who connected without contrivance. Coaches began designing offensive packages around his strengths, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to see what happened when you merge intelligence, charisma, and athletic precision into one quarterback. The prime equity clause also served another subtle purpose: accountability. Shedeur's stake in his brand's success gave him skin in the game far beyond performance bonuses. Every tweet, every soundbite, every public appearance affected not just his reputation, but his wallet. That made him careful, strategic, and increasingly respected by even his fiercest critics. When Shedeur eventually took the field mid-season, replacing a struggling starter in a high-pressure divisional matchup, the city was ready. The crowd erupted, not because they were hoping he'd succeed, but because they already believed he would. His first drive was textbook, calm under center, efficient with his reads, a 12-play sequence ending in a touchdown pass. So smooth, it made national highlight reels before the post-game interviews even aired. But the real moment came afterward. In the press conference, surrounded by microphones and flashbulbs, Shedeur didn't gloat. He talked about the offensive line. He praised the receivers. Then he thanked Cleveland. "This isn't just football," he said. "This is about earning your name. Every day, I'm here to earn mine." The next day, jersey sales surged again. But more importantly, a sense of belief took root in the locker room and the front office. What followed was one of the most inspiring rookie seasons in recent NFL history. Not because Shedeur threw 50 touchdowns or broke records. He didn't. But what he did was harder. He turned an entire city from skeptical to hopeful, from jaded to energized. And he did it by being himself. The Sanders family, always aware of their cultural weight, watched quietly. Coach Prime never interfered. But those close to the family say he smiled more than usual that season, because this wasn't just a son living in his father's shadow. It was a son building his own empire, and he was doing it the right way. The KFC clause, the spark that ignited it all, has since become folklore in sports business circles. Marketing professors reference it in case studies. Agents use it as leverage. Rookie QBs ask about it during draft interviews. In the end, Shedeur Sanders didn't just play football. He played chess on a board the league didn't even realize existed. And the final checkmate? That moment when the Browns handed him the captain's patch, officially naming him the face of the franchise. It wasn't a surprise. It was a coronation. The moment Shedeur Sanders received the captain's patch, it didn't just mark his elevation in team hierarchy. It symbolized a broader change, one that resonated far beyond the Cleveland Browns facility. For decades, leadership in NFL locker rooms was measured almost exclusively in terms of years played, veteran status, and on-field output. Shedeur flipped that paradigm. He earned it through something intangible but powerful: belief. He connected with teammates not by barking orders or throwing perfect spirals, but by showing up early, staying late, and being consistent in everything, from locker room presence to community initiatives. Veteran players who had spent years in the league without ever feeling seen by an organization now found themselves rallying behind a 22-year-old rookie. It wasn't just because Shedeur had charisma. Lots of players have that. It was because he made people around him feel like their work mattered. Whether it was a backup tight end, a scout team lineman, or a stadium groundskeeper, Shedeur remembered their names, asked about their families, and stayed after meetings to talk film or life. That kind of authentic leadership couldn't be faked, and it couldn't be ignored. As the season progressed, Shedeur's performances became a beacon of consistency. He didn't light up the stat sheet every week, but he moved the chains, made smart decisions, and rarely made the same mistake twice. His ball placement was crisp, his command of the offense grew, and most notably, he never seemed rattled. Even when facing aggressive pass rushes or trailing in the fourth quarter, his demeanor never wavered. He gave the team something they hadn't had in years: stability. But it wasn't just the Browns who were watching. Across the league, younger quarterbacks and even some established stars began mimicking Shedeur's off-field playbook. They began asking their agents about equity clauses. They started appearing in their cities more, at food drives, school assemblies, small businesses. They hired social media teams to help them tell their stories directly, cutting out the middlemen. It wasn't about ego. It was about ownership, about not being at the mercy of narrative gatekeepers. And Shedeur had made that look not just possible, but effective. NFL owners, once resistant to change, found themselves in a dilemma. On one hand, they feared the shift in power, athletes demanding more say in branding, partnerships, and even team strategy. On the other hand, it was undeniable. Shedeur had injected life into a franchise that had suffered from apathy and cynicism. Season ticket sales were up. Local businesses were thriving. Even national sponsors were taking notice of the Shedeur effect, as it was dubbed in internal NFL marketing memos. There was revenue and authenticity, and the smart owners knew it. Back in Cleveland, the city embraced him as more than a quarterback. Murals started appearing in neighborhoods, not painted by big agencies, but by local artists inspired by what he represented. Community centers invited him to speak, not because of his highlight reels, but because he gave young people, especially young black kids, someone to relate to, someone who didn't just make it, but who brought his city along with him. Shedeur didn't shy away from that responsibility. He leaned into it. He launched a local initiative called Cleveland Forward, a foundation that supported underfunded school programs and provided internship opportunities for high school students in sports media, business, and technology. It wasn't performative charity. It was structural investment, and it made an impact. On Sundays, his play continued to evolve. His pocket presence sharpened. His anticipation throws became more precise. Opposing defenses started preparing for him like they would a 10-year vet. And yet, through it all, he remained grounded. No dancing after touchdowns. No excessive celebration. Just a quiet fist bump to his lineman and a jog back to the sideline. It wasn't humility for show, it was focus. And it was infectious. By mid-season, the Browns were in playoff contention. Commentators who had dismissed him as a social media quarterback now found themselves revising their takes. Former critics praised his discipline. Analysts marveled at his ability to manage games, avoid turnovers, and command a huddle full of seasoned veterans. The question was no longer, is Shedeur the future? It was, how far can he take this team? Internally, coaches raved about his preparation. He reportedly watched more film than any rookie they'd ever coached. He didn't just memorize the playbook. He asked why each play existed, what the weak points were, and how to exploit defensive schemes based on personnel. Quarterback coaches began using his preparation methods as a blueprint for younger prospects. But the story was bigger than Cleveland. Other young players, especially at the college level, began following Shedeur's path, not just on social media, but in how they approached their futures. They studied how he integrated NIL, community impact, and professional planning into a unified brand. They noticed how he avoided the pitfalls of overexposure and managed criticism without spiraling. In a world where athletes often get consumed by their own branded machines, Shedeur had found balance. Meanwhile, in NFL locker rooms across the country, quiet conversations started happening among veterans who saw Shedeur as more than a talented rookie. They saw him as a signal, a disruption, a cultural shift that forced everyone to evolve. Players, coaches, execs, media. Late in the season, when the Browns clinched a wild card spot, Shedeur's impact came full circle. He didn't hold a press conference about it. He didn't tweet a hype video. Instead, he hosted a Thanksgiving dinner for dozens of local families in a church gymnasium, fully funded by his Prime Equity Clause proceeds. No cameras, no speeches, just food, music, and connection. That's what made him different. Because Shedeur Sanders wasn't trying to be a brand. He was trying to be a bridge between past and future, between athlete and community, between fan and franchise. When the playoffs arrived, the Browns shocked the league with a gritty win against a higher-seeded opponent. Shedeur threw for 2 touchdowns, ran for another, and conducted the offense with a surgeon's calm. After the game, when reporters asked how he managed the pressure, he simply said, "Pressure doesn't hit you if you've already earned where you stand." That one sentence went viral, And not because it was catchy, because it was earned. As his rookie year concluded, Shedeur Sanders wasn't crowned MVP. He didn't lead the league in yards. He didn't need to. He had already won something bigger. The trust of a city, the respect of a locker room, and the attention of a league. The NFL will always have stars. It will always have drama. But what Shedeur brought was something rarer, a model, a blueprint for how athletes in the 21st century could build legacies that weren't dependent on rings or records. As off-season trade talks, contract negotiations, and draft debates began to heat up, one name kept surfacing in every conversation about the future of the league's leadership class. Shedeur Sanders. Not because of what he did, but because of how he did it. By the time the offseason arrived, Shedeur's name had transcended the usual sports talk shows and started appearing in business journals, academic think pieces, and even leadership seminars. Not because he had declared for endorsements or won MVP honors, but because of what he represented. A new era of athlete self-determination. It was no longer enough for players to just play well. Shedeur had shown that you could build cultural relevance, financial independence, and community roots all before your second year in the league. This influence didn't just manifest in Cleveland. College campuses were already feeling the Shedeur effect. Quarterback coaches at the Power 5 programs were revising their off-season programs, not just with new footwork drills, but with modules on media literacy, financial literacy, and personal branding. Athletes began asking different questions. Who owns the footage of my game highlights? How can I control my narrative before the draft? What kind of off-field partnerships will allow me to give back while growing my brand? What Shedeur had done, largely unintentionally, was redefine what it meant to prepare for the league. It wasn't just about 40-yard dash times or one-lick scores anymore. It was about presence, purpose, public impact. For the first time, the intangibles that scouts always claimed to look for had a blueprint, and that blueprint wore number 14 in brown and orange. Inside the Browns' front office, a quiet revolution had begun. Analysts started tracking new performance indicators. Jersey sales by zip code, player engagement to fan retention ratios, and youth enrollment in football camps held by team members. These were not traditional football metrics, but they painted a vivid picture of Shedeur's impact. It turned out that his influence extended into team morale, stadium attendance, and even the local economy. Restaurants near the stadium saw their highest revenue in a decade. Local apparel shops couldn't keep Shedeur-themed merchandise on the shelves. That's when it hit everyone. Shedeur wasn't just a quarterback. He was an economy. But with great influence comes resistance. There were owners and traditionalists who saw this shift as dangerous. They feared losing control. After all, if players could command brand loyalty beyond the team, what would stop them from becoming bigger than the Shield? That question lingered across boardrooms in New York, Dallas, and Los Angeles. But as those discussions brewed behind closed doors, Shedeur remained focused on the only thing he ever talked about publicly: work. Back in Cleveland, the locker room dynamic had matured. Veterans, instead of bristling at a young quarterback's rise, leaned into it, not because they felt obligated, but because they recognized something real. Shedeur wasn't trying to be a savior. He wasn't angling for spotlight. He was doing what the greats do, elevating those around him. He held extra film sessions. He bought lineman recovery gear with his own money. He invited teammates to community events not to be seen, but to give them a platform. Coaches took notice. One assistant coach reportedly told a friend, "It's like having a player coach at 22. That's not something you hear often in a league built on hierarchy. But Shedeur had a way of flattening those structures with humility, preparation, and consistency. As training camp for year 2 approached, expectations were no longer theoretical. They were real. Pundits predicted a sophomore surge. Vegas adjusted the Browns' odds. Fans who had once braced for disappointment now dared to hope. And Shedeur? He didn't change a thing. He showed up the same way he did as a rookie, early prepared, and focused on service over self. Behind the scenes, his business team was quietly building something historic. A media company, not a podcast or YouTube channel, but a legitimate content studio rooted in Cleveland. The mission? To tell athlete stories from the athlete's perspective. not just his own, but those of teammates, rivals, and even high school kids from underserved communities. He wasn't waiting for ESPN or NFL films to validate his journey. He was creating his own lens, and the league was taking notes. Other young stars started making similar moves. Wide receivers launched fitness brands. Safeties began offering coding boot camps. Cornerbacks started real estate collectives. It was as if the floodgates had opened, and it all traced back to Shedeur's principle. If you build it with purpose, the field will follow. The media, for its part, struggled to keep up. Traditional commentators didn't know how to frame an athlete whose storyline wasn't driven by scandal, ego, or outbursts. He wasn't the underdog. He wasn't the villain. He wasn't even the golden boy. He was something else. A mirror, one that forced everyone to examine how they talked about young black quarterbacks, how they measured leadership, and how much control they were willing to see to athletes in a league that had historically demanded obedience. To his credit, Shedeur never addressed those narratives directly, but in press conferences he dropped quiet truths. We're all more than what we do on Sundays. Or, legacy ain't built in one game. It's built in every interaction. These weren't cliches. They were code. And those who understood. As year 2 began, the Browns took the field with Shedeur under center, not because of pressure from ownership or viral jersey sales, but because he had earned it. Every rep, every decision, every moment. And when he led a comeback win in Week 3, down 10 in the fourth 2-minute drill, no timeouts, it wasn't just a football moment. It was a confirmation that this works, that athletes can be multifaceted, thoughtful, and relentless, that leadership can come from unlikely places, and that maybe, just maybe, the NFL didn't need to be stuck in its old ways. By mid-season, his stats told a good story. Top 10 in completion percentage, second in fourth quarter passer rating, 0 multi-turnover games. But it was his off-field presence that kept growing. He was invited to business summits, featured in documentaries. Even non-sports outlets started profiling him. Forbes, Harvard Business Review, GQ. And through it all, he remained committed to the same process. Film, reps, community, rest, repeat. He once told a high school audience, if you do it for applause, you'll break when it's silent. Do it because it's right and the noise won't matter. That line would be printed on T-shirts by winter, not because it was catchy, but because it rang true. By the time the Browns clinched a playoff spot again, there was no longer any doubt. Shedeur Sanders wasn't a novelty. He wasn't a fluke. He was a force. And the NFL, whether ready or not, was entering his era,